First of all, our concerns for South Dakota. Give us your sense of where things stand right now in your home state.
We're like the rest of the nation. We're being hit by COVID-19. Most certainly, we're asking and continuing to suggest to everybody that lives in our state to use the common sense the good Lord gave them. Wear a mask. Don't be afraid to wear a mask if you're inside. We've got folks that work outside in South Dakota. If you're outside and you're working, mask isn't necessary. But if you're inside, we most certainly want you to wear one. We've got significant issues, just like every other state does, and we want to do everything we can to bend the curve again. We bent the curve before. We can do it again. We most certainly encourage all of our people to use, social distancing whenever possible. But we've lost 644 members of our community in South Dakota. We're not a big state. We've got less than 900,000 people in the entire state, and most of us know people that we've lost people that we know. A lot of us have loved ones that we've lost, and so it hits us just like it does every other state.
Senator, I went online today, and looking at your dashboard for South Dakota, it looked like there's a disproportionate effect on Native Americans, of whom you have quite a few in South Dakota. Is that the case? And if so, is there something special that can or should be done for that particular part of the community?
Our Native American community is served by Indian Health Service, if you want to call it being served. Native American leadership, our chairmen have been working very hard. In many cases, they've restricted travel in and out of our reservations, doing their best to try to stop the spread of the COVID-19 virus. But let's be honest, a number of our Native Americans, they don't have the best health care available. Not like the rest of America. They have IHS. Look, we have some of the highest rates of TB. We have some of the highest rates of diabetes in any place in the country. And so part of the challenge is, and this highlights it, that we've got to do everything we can to improve health care availability in some of the most rural parts of South Dakota, and that's where these reservations are located. So yeah, they've got a real challenge in their hands, and we continue to do multi-visits with our Native American leadership on a monthly basis, or even more often than that, talking about what we can do to assist them and making sure that they do get the supplies. But anytime you have a government-run healthcare system like IHS, and it's not really true healthcare, but it's the closest thing they've got, they don't have access to the best and finest medical needs or medical assistance, and it shows up when you have a pandemic like this.
Senator, how is this affecting the economy of South Dakota right now? And in particular, I'm mindful of the fact that there's still proposals for some more fiscal stimulus. How does the effect on the economy of South Dakota read against that possibility of more stimulus?
Well, first of all, in South Dakota, we're ag-oriented, and a lot of the ag activities, they're seasonal in nature, which means when it comes time in the spring, when the pandemic was hitting, a lot of our farmers, ranchers, and so forth were outside, where literally they were already socially distancing to begin with, but they needed to get seed, they needed to get petroleum, they needed to get chemicals, fertilizers, and so forth delivered. So those other businesses were very active during that time frame. Throughout the summer and the fall, when harvest of our wheat and our corn, our soybeans, and so forth was going on, those same farmers and ranchers were socially distant. But the producers, or the people that were servicing them, in many cases had to take the extra precautions. Our economy is moving in the right direction, but our hospitality got hit real hard in a number of our communities. Trying to socially distance, we've got the same problems everybody else does. And once again, a lot of our businesses tried to be very responsible, ask people when they did come in to socially distance and to wear masks whenever possible. We did it on a voluntary basis. Right now, we're continuing to try to send a united message to people in South Dakota that it's okay to wear a mask. If you're going to go into a grocery store, wear a mask. If you're going to be involved with a lot of people, wear a mask. Try to limit the sizes of those community activities that you're involved with, and so forth. It's common sense. We're trying to get that done so that mandatory items that may very well come in at the national level are not being imposed on places like South Dakota. So let's get ahead of the curve. Let's bend that curve, and we can do it. We've done it before. And we're getting very, very close to the point where we're going to have the vaccines available with not only Moderna, but with Pfizer both closing in on 95% effective rates, and having warp speed moving both of those forward in a very rapid fashion. we're convinced that we'll see close to 300 million doses available to the general public before the end of January.
Senator, let's turn, if we could, from South Dakota to Washington, where most Americans think there's going to be a transition happening. Certainly, it's a distinct possibility at this point. Are you concerned about some of the actions that the Trump administration is taking, perhaps on the way out the door? And let me pick one in specific, because you're on the Armed Services Committee, the announcement they're going to be withdrawing troops from Afghanistan and Iraq.
Most of us, I think, on the Armed Services Committee, and me personally, I believe that the removal of troops has got to be based upon what's actually going on the battlefield. If the battlefield commanders say that they can safely remove those troops, then it's fine. But if they're not getting that information in, then I'm really concerned about it. I want to make sure that our troops are safe, and sometimes when you pick a number and try to move to it, unless you have assurances that the battlefield commanders can handle it, you could put other people in harm's way. I know that's not what the president wants to do, but most certainly that's something that we have to ask and be reaffirmed, that we're not putting our troops in more of a harm's way by having a limited number available. So let's make sure that the decisions are being made in consultation with those battlefield commanders.
The President of the United States, of course, has particular authority when it comes to deployment of troops around the world in foreign policy. What about appointments back here at home? Because now there are signals that President Trump wants to appoint the acting controller of the currency to actually become the permanent controller of the currency with a 5-year term. Is that appropriate given where we are right now?
The president always has the ability to make the recommendation, but if it requires Senate advice and consent, that then becomes our role to make a decision as well. We'll look at it and consider that as a possibility. And once again, this is a case where the Constitution lays out who is responsible until the end of their term. President Trump is responsible until the end of his term to follow through when there are those vacancies. So it is up to him as to whether or not he wants to make the nomination. If it is one which has to be approved by the United States Senate, advice and consent, that becomes then something that our leadership will look at in consultation with the rest of the members and find out whether or not we agree or not.
Which actually takes us to the nomination of Judy Shelton for the Federal Reserve. That's sort of been withdrawn now, is voted down, but it could come back again. Do you expect that to come back?
It'll depend on whether or not we can get the votes. Look, we had the votes yesterday early in the morning, but then unfortunately when several of our members came down that were either in quarantine or actually in the case of Senator Grassley, who missed his first vote in the United States Senate since 1993 under doctor's orders, that meant that we were down by 2 votes, and on a real tight vote like that, we didn't have any votes to spare. In fact, I think they were expecting that Vice President Pence was probably going to be the tiebreaker on that one. I personally supported her nomination. I think she would have been good on the board, but nonetheless, you've got to have the votes if you want to get it done. And when you do have people missing, it makes it more difficult to get the job done, particularly when it happens on very short notice, which is what happened in this particular case.